Coming up on Arirang News, the U.S. Federal Reserve warns of potentially significant declines in the financial markets as asset prices climb. With interest rates at record lows, investors have been piling into stocks, corporate bonds, and cryptocurrencies. The South Korean government says it's going to use its policy tools to ensure that the country posts GDP growth this year of 3.5%. It's going to support industries it sees as future growth engines like semiconductors and biomedicine. And South Korea again reports fewer than 600 new cases of COVID-19 as the government pledges to get it below 500 soon. Around 7% of South Koreans have received at least one dose of a vaccine. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The U.S. Federal Reserve and its latest report is raising concerns over asset prices. Other officials, including Jay Powell and Janet Yellen, have both described markets as frothy before. But now, looking at the stock market, the Fed says investors could be vulnerable to big losses if this appetite for risk goes away. Min Soo-kyun reports.
The U.S. Federal Reserve has voiced concern over rising asset prices in the stock market, saying that it poses a high threat to the financial system. In its latest report on Thursday, the central bank warned that prices of stocks and assets are rising to levels that could leave investors with big losses. Prices of stocks and risky assets have generally increased since November, in some cases to record highs, on the back of an improved outlook for the post-COVID-19 economy. Investors have snapped up equities, cryptocurrencies, and other financial assets, and valuations of those have been high. The Fed said this is creating vulnerabilities in the financial system and that asset prices may be vulnerable to significant declines should risk appetite fall. In a statement accompanying the report, Fed Governor Lael Brainard said the situation needs to be watched closely and noted the importance of making sure the financial system is resilient. With valuations and risk appetite at elevated levels, she called for strong safeguards and tools to address risk to financial stability. Thursday's report also noted that risks associated with the course of the pandemic remain relatively high. A worsening of the global pandemic could stress the financial system in emerging markets and some European countries, and these risks together could pose an additional threat to the U.S. financial system. For now, however, the central bank evaluated the current state of the system to be sound, with both business and household balance sheets in good shape. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
South Korea's National Police Agency has decided to ban its officers working on investigations from buying any more cryptocurrency. That announcement was made Friday, and the affected officers also have to disclose how much crypto they have already. There will be penalties for those who don't comply. Sources say the move is aimed at bringing extra transparency to sensitive departments. The South Korean government says it's going to use its policy tools this year to try and achieve GDP growth of over 3.5%. It set out this goal today in an economic policy report from the Finance Ministry, which looked back on the 4 years of the Moon administration and revealed its policy plans for the administration's final year. Kim Jae-hee has this report.
The South Korean government says it will focus on economic policies to ensure GDP growth of over 3.5% this year. In its economic policy report released on Friday, the Finance Ministry cited data from the International Monetary Fund that forecasts South Korea's average GDP growth for the years 2020 to 2021 combined would reach 1.3%. This is far above the average for advanced economies, which is forecast at just 0.2%. The IMF said Korea is expected to see a small V-shaped recovery from the pandemic-hit recession, which is a smaller fluctuation than the big V-shaped recovery expected for advanced economies. The report also highlighted that the South Korean economy became the 10th largest economy in the world last year. It explained that in the first 4 years of the Moon administration, the country has shown a resilient export recovery despite the global health crisis and is currently working on speedy implementation of support projects for small business owners and those whose employment is at risk due to the pandemic. For the final year of the Moon administration, the government has pledged to nurture the so-called Big Three industries, namely system semiconductors, future cars, and biohealth. The government has also pledged to spend nearly $143 billion of funds for the Korean New Deal by 2025, in line with its goal to achieve carbon neutrality by the year 2050. It also vowed to focus on support for small business owners hit by COVID-19 and expand the supply of new housing to tackle the overheated housing market. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
Data shows South Korea posted a current account surplus in March for an 11th month in a row. The Bank of Korea says the surplus came to around $7.8 billion, up about 32% on year. For the first quarter in total, South Korea recorded a surplus of nearly $23 billion, up more than 76%. This growth was largely led by exports, which jumped more than 18% on year in March on strong shipments of automobiles and semiconductors. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news on this Friday, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good to have you back on. Thank you for making time today.
Good afternoon.
Well, let's start with stocks on Wall Street, which were down early in the session on Thursday, but ended up with a decent gain across the board. Analysts expecting a big surge in employment last month compared to a year earlier. What's the story in the global markets?
Yes, if you look at the U.S. market, overall markets will continue to show very strong strength. Dow added 0.9%, touching a record close of 34,500 plus, and S&P 500 rose by 0.8%, well above 4,200 level, and Nasdaq quite weak, but still it came back quite nicely by rising about 0.4% to about 13,600 level. Clearly, the overall jobless rate coming in, the jobless claims falling more than expected to a new yearly low, with overall April numbers being the lowest since 2000. So this is clearly showing that the labor productivity growth rate beating the overall market consensus and overall labor market looking quite good, and that added the positive sentiment for the U.S. market. Of course, there's continued to be some concern about the global economy where a lot of the COVID-19 new cases are happening. But as far as the U.S. is concerned, they plans to show quite significant vaccinations by end of July. So clearly that is fitting into the economic recovery that most of people are now expecting. So overall, U.S. market continues to lead the global economic growth rate, and obviously that resulting into highest record high level of the U.S. equity market, and also that actually added into the most of global equity market, and they're all showing quite nice trading overall rise yesterday and today.
And today here in Korea, stocks with a rise, much like that in the U.S. The Kospi again touching 3,200, the Kosdaq touching 970. Tell us about the local markets.
Yes, Korean market continues to show rising trend from yesterday. Kospi is up about 0.6%, and Kosdaq is up about 0.9%. Still, it's a little bit off from the previous peaks, but nevertheless, Kospi is near to 3,200, and Kosdaq is close to 980 level. If you look at the uncertainty about the monetary policy side, people will continue to be concerned with the Powell continue to be quite loosened in terms of the monetary policies, but Janet Yellen was talking about possibility of interest rate hike in U.S., feeding into possibility of Bank of Korea raising interest rate earlier than even U.S., and that has concerned overall market liquidity conditions or market sentiment. But Bank of Korea have come up and said that the bank shouldn't be in a rush to tighten monetary policy, despite an unexpected expected pickup in economy due to uncertainties because of the uncertainties over the COVID-19. And if you see Korea, we see continuation of overall quite a large number of the COVID-19 cases. And vaccination continues to remain quite weak relative to U.S. or any other countries in the world. So people are concerned, but overall, Korea is very much export-oriented country and global economic recovery happening that is fitting into positive trends that we're seeing in terms of Korean equity market, both sides of cusp and cosp.
And zooming out a little bit, we saw a significant rise in consumer prices last month in Korea, partly on higher oil prices, and some expect the prices could keep rising this year along with oil. So what is inflation going to look like relative to your outlook for oil?
Right. The oil price is very important, obviously, for Korea as well as global economy. If you look at the raw material cost, have been rising quite rapidly since the end of last year. Clearly, first half of this year is showing a very significant rise, and the oil price is one of that. And obviously, oil price is quite a big implication for the inflation numbers. And that number coming in at close to $70 per barrel. Right now, it is at, off from the 69.95 barrels 2 months ago. Now it's down to about $66, $67. But nevertheless, it is relatively high numbers. But I guess we are looking into the future. Right now, oil price seems to be quite stable because if you look at the pandemic related what's happening to global economy, there's still concern about the India and Japan. And also there's a gradual overall oil production that's happening because of the higher demand that we're seeing in the global economy. So supply and demand side, oil price seems to be quite reasonable. And we know that shale gas production is going to come back if the oil price continues to remain well above $65 per barrel because their overall cost level is about $40 to $45. And right now they need to have a higher cash flow in order to survive in a longer term basis. We think that the sentiment about the oil price will continue to be quite subdued with the inventory levels where it is. And yes, but the demand sentiment is quite good. So we think that it's kind of neutral territories, and we will probably see a box range or trading range somewhere between $60 to $65 per barrel in the future.
And staying with the international perspective, in late April, the won to dollar exchange rate hit a low as the dollar index declined, but the dollar has come back up a bit since then. So now won to dollar with around 11.20. A lot of that, it would seem, as things you mentioned just a minute ago, monetary policy, appetite for risk, but trade is also at play here. So tell us what you see happening with the exchange rate.
Right. As you said, the trade is very important. If you look at the South Korea's current account surplus, it has widened to $7.82 billion in favor of 2021. Obviously, it is a very strong number. The goods account surplus increased to $7.92 billion from $6.96 billion a year ago, and the service account gap narrowed to $0.9 billion from $1.65 billion. So clearly, this is positive news, say, for the Korean won movement, meaning that Korean won can appreciate further. Trade account as well as the current account are all showing very strong numbers, which means that the Korean won can appreciate even more. Yes, there are concerns about the consumer debt level in Korea and domestic consumption being weak, but still we see very strong export numbers are coming through. Global economic growth rate positively fitting into the current account surpluses, and that means that Korean won can continue to appreciate on its own. Also, on top of that, as you said, the U.S. dollar index is moving quite nicely to the downside, weakening. Right now, it is at about 90.8 index level, which is off from as high as 92 in a few weeks ago. So clearly we are seeing some depreciation environment with a very strong fiscal and monetary policy that you see in U.S. Yes, U.S. economy is very, very strong in terms of economic growth rate, which is acting as a positive implication for the U.S. dollar strengthening. But because of such a high level of the injection of liquidity and also huge amount of current account deficit, trade deficit, that has resulted into U.S. dollar being weak. So overall, we do think the Korean will appreciate relative to U.S. dollars. That should be positive news for the Korean equity market, as the foreign investor will probably come back into buying of Korean equities.
Got it. All right, we'll have to leave it there for today. Mr. Yu, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us as always, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
South Korea today reported fewer than 600 new cases of the coronavirus for a second day in a row. In terms of vaccines, around 7% of the population has gotten at least one dose, and the government's bringing back Korean nationals from India, which is battling an out-of-control wave of the virus. More than 200 Koreans arrived back this morning on a chartered flight. Kim Sung-min reports.
South Korea on Friday reported 525 new cases, staying below the 600 mark for the second straight day. Local transmissions account for more than 500 cases, with only 16 coming from overseas. The health authorities are working to bring that figure below the 500 mark.
To have stable control over virus prevention efforts, alleviate the nation's anxiety, and support the economic recovery, the headquarters will put its full efforts into making sure the daily tally falls below 500.
The Greater Seoul area remains a virus hotspot, more than 63% of the local cases coming from the region. Seoul alone reported 177 cases on Friday. Major clusters include one from Noryangjin Fisheries Wholesale Market in Seoul's Dongjakgu district, with at least 14 people confirmed, leading to almost 2,700 people requiring a COVID-19 test. And in a cluster linked to a family, restaurant, and church, a total of 18 people have now been confirmed to have the virus. As of Friday, around 7% of the total population in Korea have received the vaccine. Health authorities are aiming to give vaccines to 13 million people by the end of next month. Meanwhile, the 203 South Korean nationals who left India on Thursday have arrived home, part of the country's efforts to bring back its nationals from the virus-hit country. The passengers were on board a special Asiana Airlines chartered flight, the second out of the 12 flights scheduled for this month. Another 170 nationals are set to arrive on Sunday. All arrivals from India must stay in government-designated facilities for 7 days. If they test negative again, they will be able to stay in quarantine for a further week at their homes. They will then have to get tested a third time for their quarantine to be lifted. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
And another vaccine is likely on the way to market, this one developed by the German company CureVac, which could help ease the pressure on supplies around the world. The CureVac product uses mRNA to trigger an immune response like the ones from Pfizer and Moderna. It's awaiting the results of a late-stage clinical trial, which could come as soon as next week. The other two mRNA vaccines, by Pfizer and Moderna, have high efficacy rates, but CureVac has an advantage in that it can be stored at normal refrigerator temperature rather than the extreme cold required by the Pfizer jab. And in New York, they're getting ready to reopen Broadway. Tickets for shows will go on sale again from this week for shows to start in September. New York City is also planning to offer free COVID-19 vaccines to tourists in a bid to bring people back. Choi Won-jong reports.
Broadway shows in New York City will be back in business as early as September. After a month closed due to the pandemic, the city and the state leaders have given them the green light to reopen at full capacity.
And we have dramatically lifted capacity, basically to the CDC social distancing guidelines. That's really the capacity restriction that remains, the 6 feet social distancing. Broadway tickets go on sale today at 100% capacity for theaters. The shows open September 14th.
Cuomo said Wednesday that theaters will have to decide their own entry requirements, such as proving people's COVID-19 vaccination status. Ticket sales kick off on Thursday. And the city is preparing to give COVID-19 vaccines to tourists. The mayor said Thursday vaccination sites will open as soon as this weekend. And they will start offering vaccines if the city gets a state approval.
Come here, it's safe, it's a great place to be, and we're going to take care of you. We're going to make sure you get vaccinated while you're here with us.
Vaccination sites will be set up at tourist hotspots like Times Square and Central Park, and medical staff will use the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. In New York City, Asian Americans are the most vaccinated ethnic group. The New York Times reports 68% of the adult Asian population have received at least one dose. Despite potential language barriers and fears of violence against the Asian American community, the paper says they got help from Asian American organizations in the city. With over 680,000 Asian Americans vaccinated so far in New York City, white adults are the next highest, at a vaccination rate of 49%. 최원정, Arirang News.
And in other news, South Korea's foreign minister, who met this week with his U.S. counterpart, says he got an explanation of the Biden administration's new policy on North Korea, and he expects North Korea will get an explanation too. Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong spoke to Yonhap News in London, where he met on Wednesday with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Chung said the policy, as explained by Blinken, was practical and realistic. And he said the U.S. should appoint someone to the now vacant post of special envoy to North Korea, because that would indicate Washington is giving attention to the issue. The attorney for Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer convicted of murdering George Floyd, has requested a retrial, saying his client was not able to get a fair trial because of pretrial publicity and the court's refusal to change the venue. The petition filed Wednesday said the court had abused its discretion. Chauvin was convicted of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. He had knelt on Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes as Floyd was handcuffed and struggling to breathe. Chauvin now awaits sentencing in the coming weeks. Another milestone for Elon Musk's company, SpaceX. It's had a successful launch and landing of its prototype rocket dubbed Starship. The last several attempts had ended in fiery explosions either before takeoff, during flight, or on landing. And Jeff Bezos' space tourism company, Blue Origin, has announced details of a trip to space set for this July. Kim Do-yeon has the details.
The latest Starship prototype, the SN-15 from Elon Musk's SpaceX, made another successful high-altitude test flight from Texas on Wednesday. But perhaps more important than liftoff, all eyes were on the landing, following 2 fiery explosions at that stage during test flights earlier this year.
And we have ignition, Starship heading back to the landing zone. We are down, the Starship has landed.
The Starship SN-15 is a heavy-lift rocket prototype capable of carrying passengers and 100 tons of cargo on future missions to the Moon and Mars. A safe return to Earth allows the rocket to be used again, making space travel more common and affordable. On the same day, Blue Origin billionaire Jeff Bezos' private rocket company released details of a suborbital sightseeing space trip launching on July 20th, the anniversary of the moon landing 52 years ago, and a milestone in private commercial space travel. 1 seat out of the 6 available to passengers is to be auctioned off.
Now, as you've seen, this is going to be an incredible experience for all of our customers, and certainly for our astronaut winner, the winner of this auction. They are going to, he or she will write him or herself into the history books, not just of spaceflight, but of history.
Proceeds from the auction will be donated to the company's foundation. Apart from history and the charity, the entertainment angle cannot be ignored.
This capsule, the New Shepard vehicle, has been built with the human spaceflight experience built in from the very beginning. You see those big, gorgeous windows? Those are the largest windows that have ever flown in space. Perfect from which to gaze out, see the beautiful stars and the colors of Earth popping back at you.
These signals indicate commercial space travel for civilians is coming. And in addition to these 2 companies, Virgin Galactic is currently looking at early 2022 for their first civilian flight. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.